Chapter 6. Raymond Makes a Pilgrimage. Chicago was sitting up late that Saturday night. For 3 days in succession, the city had been in the grip of a torrid wave, the first hot spell of the summer. The weatherman had not made any promises for a cool Sunday, but around 9 o'clock that evening, the huge waters of Lake Michigan, which had lain inert and placid, began to stir. A breeze arose, and Chicago was sitting up and drinking it in. It was sitting up on the roofs and doorsteps of its tenements in the slums, and on the verandas of its residences on the avenues and boulevards. Henry Everett and his wife were sitting on the veranda of their home on Independence Boulevard. They were all alone that evening, and Mr. Everett had slunk back to his old ways and was sitting in an undershirt only. He was twirling a cigar between his fingers. The doctor had ordered him to smoke as little as possible, but it was hard to break the habit of a lifetime. They were talking of Raymond. "Where did he go this evening?" Mr. Everett was asking. "He was going to the settlement on the south side," he said. Mrs. Everett answered her husband. "I don't like the people he's getting in with." Mr. Everett spoke in a slightly raised voice. "What interest is there for him to go to settlements? There are plenty of women looking after the poor." His wife was silent. She was hoping that her husband would forget Raymond and go calmly to bed. Mr. Everett had not been well that day. The Everetts were rounding out their 10th year in Chicago. They had come to the metropolis in the prime of life. These 10 years, in spite of their prosperity, had greatly aged them, especially the last year. In the 9 months which had elapsed since the day he had driven Hilda Thorson from his house, a great change had come over Henry Everett and his wife. Shortly before Christmas, their second daughter, Eleanor, had married and had gone to Milwaukee to live. She was the fourth of their children to marry, and they were now left alone with Raymond. But between the three, and especially between father and son, there was no peace. They had drifted apart. Raymond was not living up to his father's expectation. The boy's fool escapade with Hilda repelled Mr. Everett in the first place, and he was becoming daily more embittered by his son's subsequent conduct and attitude toward things. He had planned for Raymond to become a great lawyer, a congressman someday. He had ambitions for the boy, and he had money to back those ambitions. But Raymond was beginning to look more and more like a schoolteacher. He had not the matter-of-factness of his brothers. He was not businesslike. He seemed to be walking in a dream. To the worries about his son, there was added, early in the spring, another worry. It was about Mr. Everett's, health. In the latter part of March, he was taken ill with a cold. He was in bed 10 days, which was longer than usual. When he got out of bed, he was not mending as rapidly as he should. The family physician came daily and prescribed tonics, but Henry Everett was not coming to. One day the physician suggested a consultation. He called up a specialist. In the office of the specialist, Mr. Everett felt as if he had suddenly become a watch, and the doctor was a watchmaker and was taking him apart. He made him undress from head to foot, pounded his chest, listened in between his ribs, looked into his eyes with an electric light. But it was on the blood pressure the physician lingered most. Henry Everett had never known that there was such a thing as blood pressure, and while he was dressing, the physician explained it to him. He talked to him about the heart and kidneys, their functions. His heart and kidneys were not functioning well. Not very badly, but not well. Too much strain, too much excitement. He had worked too hard. There was nothing to be alarmed about, no immediate danger, but he would have to be careful, very careful, in the future. Mrs. Everett got the rest of the instructions along with her husband. There must be no more overexertion for Mr. Everett. That meant not only in business, but at the table as well. Mr. Everett must be put on a diet. He gave her a list of things her husband had better not eat. Cigars were reduced to a minimum, with a warning to stop smoking altogether, and the sooner the better. The warm spell had especially enervated him, and that afternoon they had been to the doctor's. The physician had again repeated his oft-time warning against worry and excitement. This, he said, was to be observed doubly in the hot weather. Since his illness, Mr. Everett had begun to talk more frequently about their hometown. He seemed to be thinking back. There was a kind of regret in his voice whenever he spoke of Stillwell, their home there, the sand pit back of it. Now, too, the conversation drifted gradually to Stillwell, and Mrs. Everett joined in it heartily. She liked to talk of Stillwell. The more the years separated them from the place, the more she longed for it. Deep in her heart was the conviction that the city was responsible for their troubles, for her son's, for her husband's troubles. Had they never known Chicago that sickness would never have come upon him? One never did see many old men in Chicago, while in Stillwell people did grow old. Her husband, it seemed to her, was thinking about that too, though he was not speaking of it. In Stillwell, his heart would never have given way on him like that. But even about Stillwell, their conversation was not always as free and easy now as it was before the incident with Hilda. Time and again, in the course of a conversation about their former home and surroundings, the name of their neighbor, Carl Thorson, would come up. In the past, that name had had no significance to them. Now it burned in their memory with scarlet letters. Instinctively, each of them sensed when the other was thinking of the Thorsons, and both would feel awkward. It was close to 11. The breeze had refreshed them, and Henry Everett made his way into the house, his wife following. "I am so glad you came," Miss Straight was saying to Raymond at the stroke of 11. They were waiting for a car which was to take him to the west side. The car stopped with a crash, and Raymond swung onto it. When he had gained a seat, he turned and looked back. Miss Straight was waving her hand to him. The streets were empty, and the car was going at high speed. When he looked a second time, only a few moments later, the settlement house had fused with the darkness and was indistinguishable. On the other hand, the huge black smokestacks of the packing plants and the stockyards, past which the car was speeding, stood vaguely towering against the lighter blackness of the night. The streets were quiet, except for the saloons. Here there was life, song, and music. Groups of people were standing in front of the swinging doors. From the ladies' entrance, girls and women were coming out hot and flushed. Some hung on the arms of men. Men's arms twined themselves about the waists of others. Raymond was thinking of Maud Straight, of the evening he had just passed with her. They had given a dance for the people of the neighborhood at the community house, as the settlement was known, and Miss Straight had invited him, had insisted on his coming. It was not an ordinary event, this dance. The community house was trying an experiment. It was seeking to wean the boys and girls of the district away from the neighborhood dance halls with their evil influences. All of Chicago's newspapers carried stories about the dance. They wrote editorials about it. They praised the way in which the famous back of the yard settlement was tackling one of the city's grave problems. Miss Straight was mentioned in all of these stories and praised as the able and energetic spirit behind this movement. All evening long, Miss Straight had been greatly in demand. They had nearly 40 couples on the floor, and she chaperoned them. There were questions to answer, orders to give, refreshments to serve. She was all smiles and enthusiasm one moment, and alert and collected the next. Several times during the evening she was alone with Raymond, a few moments each time, and in these moments she was transformed. Her poise was like a mask which she had put on for others. She was restless, seemed uncertain, and was eager for approval, his approval. She was asking Raymond for his advice, his opinion, as if his opinion was vital and counted above all. Also, she was trying to be a girl, merely a girl with him. She was drawing him into her friendship. She was fluttering on the fringe of intimacy. Just before they parted, Miss Straight told him some of the plans she had for the next winter. They were to give special courses in history and civics at the settlement. It was important that the young immigrants of the neighborhood know the history of the country and understand its constitution. It would be nice if Mr. Everett could spare 2 evenings a week and teach one of the classes. Raymond told her he would think about it. He tried to think about it, but the car had come down Halsted Street at a rapid clip and was humming right into the ghetto, 14th Street, 12th Street. Here there was life. Restaurants were open. Herring and delicatessen stores were still doing a brisk business. People were preparing to go out picnicking in the morning. Harrison Street, saloons, music. Van Buren Street, painted girls. A policeman taking in 3 corners at a glance. Jackson Boulevard. It was on Jackson Boulevard he had met Hilda the first time. Hilda. He changed cars mechanically and was at home a little before 12. His mother was waiting for him. There were some things in the icebox if he wanted a bite, but Raymond was not hungry. He asked about his father. Did he stand the heat all right? His mother gave him a reassuring answer. He was undecided for some moments, but finally spoke. He was going out of town in the morning, with friends. Oh, just for an outing. He would probably leave the house very early, before breakfast. His voice and manner did not invite questioning, and Mrs. Everett heaved a low sigh and went to her room. Raymond stepped out on the veranda. He was fatigued. The smell of the stockyards was in his nostrils. He dropped into a large wicker chair. There was a train leaving for Stillwell at 5:45. He had had an eye on that train for weeks and had made sure of the time. He was going with that train. He had not seen his hometown in more than 5 years. But it was not Stillwell he was thinking of. It was Hilda. He must know what had become of the girl. In Stillwell he might learn something of her, perhaps. 2 weeks earlier he had met an old schoolmate of his from Stillwell, Tom Andrews. Tom ran right into him on State Street. At first Raymond experienced a sick feeling. He was expecting Tom to grin at him, to speak about Hilda. But Hilda apparently was not in Tom's thoughts. He was delighted at seeing Raymond, dragged him into an ice cream parlor, and they talked for an hour. Raymond finally got up courage and began asking questions about his old home, about the Thorson home, the Thorson family. But Tom vaguely recalled that Carl Thorson had died some years back. As for the widow Thorson, she did not seem to be on the map at all, at least not to Tom Andrews. Raymond's thoughts were rambling. There was a swimmy feeling in the back of his head. He rose and went into his room to snatch a few hours' sleep. He set the clock to ring at 5. A half hour would bring him to the train. It would take him less than 15 minutes to be dressed and ready. The milkman's steps on the pavement woke him 4:45. He got up and dressed quickly. At 5 sharp, he was out of the house. Luck was with him. He ran into a passing streetcar. He was 20 minutes ahead of time and walked into the station lunchroom for a cup of coffee and a sandwich. The home of his childhood lay nearly 3 miles from the station, and a streetcar brought him within 2 miles of it. These 2 miles Raymond had to walk. For a number of blocks there were still city houses. Then he was in the country. Slender poplar trees lined the sides of the road, and the grass was a foot high. His former home lay beyond the hilly elevation, and he did not see it. He was in no hurry to get to it. It was early. He stretched himself on the grass on one side of the road and took out a paper, but he did not read. It was 9:15. In a few minutes, the regular Sunday morning procession of churchgoers should begin. In his childhood, Raymond recalled, he used to be able to tell who was coming a long way off. He had various ways of identifying the neighboring farmers. Sometimes it was the horses, sometimes the buggy he could distinguish, sometimes it was the manner of driving. Would he distinguish his one-time neighbors as readily now? The pounding of horses' hoofs communicated itself to his body even before it reached his ears. A single buggy was coming. He could not identify it at a distance. Only when the buggy was quite near did he recognize its occupants. It was old man Sheridan with his daughter, Miss Sheridan, the schoolteacher. The old man had not aged much. His bushy eyebrows and thick, untrimmed beard were perhaps a shade grayer. But his daughter had changed. Miss Sheridan's hair was snow white, and her face was thin and seamed. Mr. Brand came next, double buggy, wife and one daughter, the youngest. He wondered what had become of Lena Brand. Lena was his age, 22. They had gone to school together. Was she married? He was recalling their common school friends and wondering which one of them Lena might have married. Several more buggies passed, but he was too absorbed in these speculations to notice who their occupants were. The day was going to be hot, but the morning was still pleasant. The earth under him was oozing a raw, vapory warmth. The grass was radiating a listless fragrance. The lack of sleep the night before and the long ride on the train in the early morning had tired him. He put a part of the Sunday paper under his head, used another part to shield himself from the sun, and was asleep. He woke past noon. The buggies with churchgoers were coming back from the city at a brisk clip. He was hungry and turned back to the city in search of a restaurant. On the square, he found a lunchroom open and walked in. There were only 3 persons in the place. He recognized the proprietor. He had known him in years past. A formidable individual this man had then been. Now he was thin and washed out. There were rings under his eyes, and from his head the hair had disappeared in strings, leaving whole spaces bare. It was 2:00 by the time he got back to the place where he had slept in the forenoon. Buggies were again in evidence. People were going visiting. He passed several vehicles without recognizing their occupants. A buggy passed him and stopped short. A young woman was calling him by his first name. It was Lena Brann. Her features were more elongated than they had been 10 years earlier. She had lost her plumpness, but he recognized her nonetheless. He stepped up to her. They shook hands. Lena introduced her husband, Jim Swayze, and Raymond recognized in him the son of a farmer in the vicinity who had been a big boy when he, Raymond, was starting school. Lena did the talking, and he was grateful to her. For an instant, he was in a fever, but Lena's eyes were reassuring. She seemed genuinely glad to see him. Her questions were open and friendly. What was he doing in Stillwell? Come to visit and was looking up old friends? That was nice. He would find quite a few changes. By this time, Raymond had himself in hand. He asked about some of their common acquaintances, friends. Lena rattled off the names with a concise account in each case. Ed Larkin, one of their childhood playmates, was married last spring and had a good position with the railroad company. Fred Warner, another of the boys in their immediate vicinity, had married Dorothy Aker. He had a little dairy farm up the road. Millie Grant had gone to Chicago last year. She had a good position in the Farmers and Merchants Bank, but was offered a better job in Chicago and left. Raymond veered the conversation around to their house, the people that lived in it, and then, with casual voice but beating heart, inquired about the Thorsons, watching all the time for a change in Lena's face or expression. But there was none. He knew, of course, she was saying, that old man Thorson was dead these many years. Mrs. Thorson, that is, the second Mrs. Thorson, tried for a time to keep the business going with hired help, but things did not prosper, and she sold the place to a Mr. Crane. Mr. Crane was living there now. He was not in the sand business. He was a veterinary surgeon. Lena had apparently forgotten Hilda, and Raymond, again acting very casually, reminded her of the girl. Lena then recalled that Hilda had left home shortly after her father's death. She believed that the girl had gone to Chicago to live with relatives there. She did not get along with her stepmother. That was the last seen or heard of her. An impatient gesture came into Raymond's face. He had heard enough. Lena now quickly explained to him that they were on their way to visit her husband's sister, living on the Willow Grove Road. If he, Raymond, was going to stay in town any length of time, they would like to have him come up to the farm and visit with them. They had bought the old Lyman place 2.5 miles up the road. Raymond was uncertain as to how long he was going to stay in the city, but should he have the time, he said he would look in on them. With this, they shook hands, Mr. Swayze pulled the reins, and they drove off. He walked at a rapid pace, and in a few minutes he stood in front of his one-time home. Several youngsters were playing in the yard, and he lingered about, watching them. A girl of 18 came out and looked at him. He did not know her, and she did not know who he was. The man who bought the place from his father had come from another part of the state. He took a sweeping look at the house, the grounds, the barn. The house had aged and was in need of a coat of paint, badly. The barn looked shabby. Raymond was about to enter the yard, introduce himself, and ask for permission to go over the place, but changed his mind. He walked down 100 paces and stood in front of what was once Hilda's home. A tall, thin man with a cement-colored face was walking briskly across the yard. He was wearing overalls over his Sunday trousers. In his hand, he carried a bottle, medicine, Raymond presumed. The man gave him a passing glance and went into the barn. A woman came out of the house, a stout woman with a florid face. She was looking at Raymond searchingly, and he walked into the yard and greeted her. He inquired about Mrs. Thorson, but the woman knew nothing of her. They had bought the house, she said, through the recommendation of a friend. Her husband had seen Mrs. Thorson only once for a few minutes. When they came to take possession of the place, the Thorsons had already moved. He bade her good day and walked off. He went down the road another mile and noted some of the changes that had taken place. There were several new barns, and the names on the letter boxes in 2 instances were new and unfamiliar. There was a train going to Chicago at 5:30 and another at 7. He could make the first train if he started for the city at once, but he saw no reason for hurrying. He would not be coming to the place again so quickly. It was pleasant in the fields. He turned into a narrow lane which led on to another road a mile distant. He cut himself a walking stick from a willow branch and rambled along. At intervals of 8 to 10 minutes an automobile would pass, but for that the country was as calm and peaceful as it had been in his early childhood, when he, with his older brothers or with some playmates, would go down this road to the creek to bathe. The creek was there, and its waters were as clear as ever. He stood for a long while on the bridge, looking into the water and listening to its murmur. It was familiar, and it was new. Loud, girlish laughter from a passing automobile brought him back to reality. He would just about have time for a bite of supper before the train left if he hurried. He started for the city. The train was cutting its way through the twilight. It was an express. The fields, forests, farmhouses looked like large, weird paintings. His eyes grew heavy, and he closed them. It seemed to him that he was not really himself, but someone else, a stranger, an old man. He had lived long and was weary. They were going past villages without stopping. There were people in these villages. They were on earth, rooted in the earth. He was soaring in space, would always soar, would never have firm ground under his feet like other people. Never. It was after 11 when he came home. He was late on purpose. He did not want to be seen by his father, his mother. He went straight to his room and began to undress. His mother entered. He stopped taking his clothes off and remained seated on the bed. She was standing. For some moments both were silent. Finally she asked, "Were you in Stillwell?" He looked up at her. Their eyes met. He lowered his. "Yes," he said. His voice was hollow. He was waiting for more questions, but she did not ask. Mrs. Everett walked out as quietly as she had come in. She closed the door behind her. It seemed to him she was weeping. He sat for a long time, staring into space.